Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a topic that is literally everywhere in the news but totally misunderstood: wars for oil. For decades, the baseline assumption has been that the quest for petroleum directly drives global conflict. Today, we're moving past the simplistic, super polarizing headlines to reveal the hidden, actual mechanics of energy and war. We are going to look at what the data actually says about how oil shapes global security.
Here is the roadmap for today's Explainer. We'll start with the engine of modern war, tackle the oil wars myth, look at the real pathways to conflict, dive into the rise of petroaggression, and then finish up with the future of energy security. Let's get right into it.
Part 1. The engine of modern war and how fossil fuels completely mechanize the battlefield. To really get where we are today, we kind of have to start by looking at the past to see exactly how oil transformed from just an everyday commodity into the absolute lifeblood of military power.
Look at this shift. The 20th century fundamentally hardwired petroleum to military might. Before this era, armies were quite literally marching on their feet or riding horses, and navies, they were chugging along on coal. But the second the internal combustion engine was adapted for the battlefield, everything changed. Oil became the ultimate strategic asset. Almost overnight, a military without oil was basically obsolete.
You can see how this ramps up on the timeline. It really kicks into gear around 1912, when Winston Churchill makes this monumental call to transition the British Navy from coal to oil, just to make the ships faster and more efficient. Fast forward to World War I, between 1914 and 1918, and boom, we get gas-powered tanks and airplanes hitting the battlefield. By the time World War II breaks out in 1939, modern combat is completely addicted to petroleum. Think about the infamous Blitzkrieg tactics. Those lightning-fast tank and aircraft maneuvers simply couldn't happen without oceans of liquid fuel. Petroleum literally became the engine of modern war.
Moving to Part 2, the oil wars myth. Are conflicts really just simple resource grabs? Now that we've established why oil is so historically crucial as a military asset, it's time to confront a massive assumption we all tend to make when we hear about wars in resource-rich areas.
Whenever we analyze conflicts, like the 1991 or 2003 U.S. interventions in Iraq, for example, the public debate completely fractures. On one side, you've got critics shouting blood for oil and accusing nations of straight-up imperialism. On the exact opposite side, you hear government officials swearing up and down that the conflict has, quote, literally nothing to do with oil. It leaves us stuck in this incredibly polarizing dilemma, making it pretty tough to see the truth.
Well, Professor Emily Meyerding actually has a name for this. She calls it the oil wars myth. Her research suggests that this classic Hollywood-style idea of an oil war, where one country invades another specifically to capture its oil fields, pump the crude, and pocket the cash, is actually incredibly rare. In fact, it's vastly overblown.
The myth tells us that countries fight simply to steal oil. But reality is way more complicated. Meyerding did a deep dive into famous historical cases, like the Chaco War in the 1930s or even Japan's attack on the Dutch East Indies in World War II, and found that physically stealing oil is a massive, massive headache. Think about it. You've got international sanctions, constant threats of sabotage, and the sheer infrastructure you need to pull it off. It's a logistical nightmare. Conquering an oil field just isn't the primary trigger for aggression. But actually, that brings up a huge question. If they aren't fighting to steal the oil, how on earth does oil cause war?
Which brings us to Part 3, real pathways to conflict and how energy actually shapes geopolitics. This is where the nuanced reality kicks in.
To figure this out, we're going to look at some phenomenal research by political scientist Jeff Colgan. His data found that since 1973, between a quarter and a half of all interstate wars actually are linked to oil, just not in that simplistic theft way we usually think of. He maps out 8 specific pathways that lead from oil to war, and they break down into 3 big buckets: market structure, producer politics, and consumer access concerns. Let's unpack a couple of these.
First up, under market structure, we have the pathway of grievance. Imagine a petrostate where foreign oil workers, massive international companies, and foreign militaries are all brought in to protect the oil assets. That setup alone can spark deep, deep local resentment, and extremist groups know this. They actively weaponize these specific economic and political grievances to recruit followers and fuel violent insurgencies. So it's an indirect but highly volatile chain reaction caused by the industry's presence.
Then, on the flip side, you have consumer access concerns. This pathway drives conflict when major international powers butt heads over vulnerable transit routes. We're talking about crucial choke points like the shipping lanes in the South China Sea, the Strait of Hormuz, or thousands of miles of international pipelines. In these cases, countries aren't fighting over the oil fields themselves, they're fighting to secure the highways that deliver that vital energy to their economies. It creates massive international security dilemmas because one country's defensive move to protect a shipping lane looks exactly like an aggressive threat to everyone else.
Part 4. Rise of Petroaggression. The danger of insulated leaders. Of all the pathways to conflict, this one is arguably the most fascinating and absolutely the most dangerous.
It falls under that second category we mentioned, producer politics. And Colligan actually coined a brilliant term for this specific phenomenon in his book, Petroaggression.
So what exactly is petroaggression? Basically, it happens when a staggering amount of oil money flows directly into the hands of a revolutionary state. This immense wealth acts like a shield. The leaders can use it to buy off the public with huge subsidies, or they use it to fund a massive security state to crush any domestic opposition. Because they don't rely on their citizens for tax revenue, they are completely insulated from domestic accountability. It essentially gives them a free pass to engage in incredibly risky, aggressive foreign policy without that normal, everyday fear of being overthrown at home if a war goes south.
And the statistical proof backing this up is undeniable. If you look at the data, petrostates, which are those tall, dark bars on the chart, get into significantly more militarized disputes than your standard democracies or even non-oil revolutionary states. Plus, the data shows they aren't just getting pulled into these fights defensively, they are statistically way more likely to be the attackers. They're throwing the first punch.
Let's put a hard number on that, because this is wild. The data reveals that a revolutionary petrostate has a staggering 250% higher propensity to instigate an international conflict compared to a typical non-petrostate. I mean, 250%. That isn't just a minor blip. That's a massive statistical anomaly, proving that oil fundamentally rewires how a nation behaves on the global stage.
And we've seen this play out in the real world time and time again. Think about leaders who use their massive national oil wealth to bankroll military adventurism. You've got Saddam Hussein in Iraq using his unchecked power to invade Iran and later Kuwait. You've got Muammar al-Gaddafi in Libya funding repeated aggressive border wars down in Chad. Or Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran, who used oil revenues to prolong grueling regional conflicts. In every single one of these cases, the oil wasn't the prize they were fighting over. The oil was the enabler. It was the blank check paying for the aggression.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, Future of Energy Security. Shifting maps and new battlegrounds. So, knowing all of this, understanding the complex, indirect ways that oil actually fuels conflict, what does the future look like? Because the global energy map is shifting right before our eyes. Look, even with the massive hydraulic fracturing or fracking boom in the US making America far more energy independent, the global market is still deeply interconnected. On top of that, researchers estimate that up to 16 developing nations, many of them in Africa, are on the verge of becoming brand new oil exporters. That means the risk of petroaggression isn't going away, it's just packing its bags and moving to new regions. Throw in the rise of global powers like China and the growing vulnerability of those global shipping lanes, and the recipe for conflict over energy access is still very much on the table.
That leaves us with one incredibly critical question to take away from today's explainer. As the world desperately attempts to pivot toward renewable energy and global supply lines get completely rewired, will the deadly, hidden pathways of oil conflict finally be closed for good? Or are we just drawing the battle lines of tomorrow over new transit routes, new resources, and a brand new batch of petrostates? It's a complex, unpredictable reality, but hopefully, by understanding the true mechanics of how energy drives war, we can better navigate what's coming next. Thanks for watching.